China buys Greece's largest port, adding a major piece to its One Belt, One Road initiative. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China plans to build a modern-day Silk Road connecting China, Central Asia and Europe, and that took a big step forward last month with the purchase of the Greek port of Piraeus. Beijing's One Belt, One Road initiative is designed to deepen trade ties across Asia, the Indian Ocean region and Europe by land and sea. For Greece, the $320 million deal marks the second major privatization for the bankrupt country since last year. Later, we'll talk with several experts about the political and economic impact for the region and beyond. But we begin in Athens with CCTV's Filio Kontrafouri. And Filio, China has been looking to expand its One Belt, One Road initiative, and Greece has been struggling economically. So what does this deal mean for both countries?
Well, that's right, Anand. And actually, the fact that this deal was signed at the Greek Prime Minister's office in a very big and elaborate ceremony, it only shows the importance that this deal has for both sides, where both sides are realizing the potential that the port of Piraeus has. Now, Greece has embarked in a very ambitious privatization program that has not exactly going quite well. And Greece hopes now with this investment that this will attract even more similar investments at a time that is very difficult for the Greek economy. And it is a deal that here it is seen as a confidence vote for Greece during these very difficult times. At the same time, both the government and many economists say that it is investments like this one that China has made at the port of Piraeus that are the key for Greece to return to an economic growth, because such investments not only mean more revenue for the state, but even more importantly, they mean more jobs, and in a country where officially 1 in 4 is unemployed. On the other hand, China is aiming really highball here, aiming to turn the port of Piraeus into Europe's largest port hub and the main gate for Chinese exports into Europe. Now, the port of Piraeus is a faster route compared to other northern European alternatives, so that makes maritime transport even more cost effective. And given that COSCO already attracts multinationals like Samsung Electronics, when its operations expand at the port of Piraeus, that means that even more businesses will have access to even more markets, Anand.
Thanks, Filio. That's CCTV's Filio Kontrafouri reporting from Athens. Joining us to talk about all this is George Zogopoulos. He's a researcher with the International European Training Center and the founder of ChinaandGreece.com. He joins us from Istanbul. With us from London is Linda Yue, an economist and author. She's currently an economics professor at the London Business School. And Zheng Shixue joins us from Beijing. He is a professor and the deputy director of the Institute of European Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thanks to all of you. Zheng Shixue, let me start with you. When we look at this Chinese investment in the port of Piraeus, how does it fit into China's broader One Belt, One Road economic plan?
Well, as you know, that some people say that the so-called One Belt, One Road is a kind of a concept. But, well, I would say it's really something, as we say, it's a kind of the so-called ground project. And it can be said that it's a basket. You can put everything in it. We have policy coordination, the so-called international financial trade, and also investment, and also people-to-people contact. So, as you know, that more than 2/3 of China's products for the European market are transported by sea. So if China can control that kind of a port in Greece, and that will save lots of money. It is reported that by transferring products to that port, I think the whole journey can save 7 days or 10 days. So that's a big save of capital for China. So that will be a greater benefit for China's trade with Europe and with other parts of the world.
Linda, of course, this is a Chinese investment in the Greek port of Piraeus, but is China here thinking far more ambitiously? Is it, as Shishui just pointed out, going to be the gateway to European domestic markets for China?
I think Greece is one gateway. China has also invested actually quite a lot around the European Union. For instance, bought assets in Portugal, as well as investing much more broadly, even in places like Germany and the UK developed markets. But I think what Greece offers, of course, is the opportunity to buy key strategic assets like ports, which would help China in terms of its, you mentioned there, the One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road policy, where China is pushing itself commercially into Central Asia and into Europe. And I think the other thing probably to say is China's interest in Europe is hastened by the fact that it's easier for the Chinese to invest in Europe than in America, because in the United States there's greater scrutiny given to Chinese investments, especially if there's state financing involved. By contrast, countries like Greece, which are in a rescue program, in other words, is being bailed out by the International Monetary Fund and by the European Union, it needs to sell assets in order to raise money. And so far, this is one of the biggest privatizations in Greece, and Greece is actually quite far behind in terms of the amount of assets it's supposed to be selling. So that gives you, I think, a glimpse as to why it is for both countries. I think in this instance, it may actually be quite a good deal.
So, George, Greece needs to sell assets to raise money. How does this investment by the Chinese help Greece?
Well, China plays a very important role in that regard since 2009, and the recent deal is very important for two reasons. The first is that China will give some money to Greece and will invest more. And the second is that this investment can give a signal possibly to additional investors in Greece that this government or any next government will be prepared to sell more state-owned enterprise. I find it very critical, especially for the time this happened, and possibly this new Greek government can make a new beginning in terms of implementing privatization, because the progress of Greece in that regard since 2009 has been rather poor. The port of Piraeus can be a beginning towards this direction.
Shishui, if we look at the bilateral relationship between China and Greece, how does this fit into China's overall strategy to strengthen the relationship with Greece?
Well, as you know, that China and Greece have established the so-called strategic partnership, and in the past, also China got some help from Greece by shifting the Chinese from Libya and other parts of the world. So China is quite happy about Greece's kindness. So now Greece is in economic difficulty. So China has this kind of willingness to help Greece by making investment in this country. So it's a win-win situation for China and Greece.
Linda, if we look at trade routes around the world, we can see that, for instance, the port of Piraeus here is the nearest port, North Mediterranean port, to the Suez Canal. And as Shishui pointed out earlier in the show, this would speed up Chinese exports to their markets by something like 7 to 10 days, 7 to 11 days. How significant is that, the fact that goods can get to market far quicker?
It is very important. Even though China has rebalanced its economy so that services is now a bigger part of its growth engine than manufacturing in terms of exports and transport and security of transport, of course, anything that facilitates trade would be a huge plus, especially at a time, if you look at global trade, it's actually stalled. So global trade really could use a boost. And I would say for China, the import of raw materials, the export of manufactured goods, anything that makes that easier, especially along the Silk Road as China expands its trade links beyond the Asian region, I think will be quite important. But I think beyond that, a port is a real asset. And I think if you look at where China is investing, they've done better in terms of investing in real assets like ports, like buying machinery, for instance, in the financial sector. Some financial investments over the past few years haven't been as profitable. So I think in one sense, this would actually be better anyways for Chinese overseas investment, which is the next push, because China doesn't just want to push trade these days, it wants to push outward investment. But I should just quickly add that we shouldn't overlook the fact that there is resistance within Greece, of course. Selling off national assets is controversial, and there have been protests, especially by workers who are worried about the takeover by a Chinese company, because when China invests overseas, it often brings its own people, and employment is always one of those concerns whenever you have this kind of privatization. And this, we should just mention that this is certainly the case here as well.
George, what kind of opposition is there in Greece to this type of investment that we're seeing?
Well, every time China talks about the investment of COSCO in the port of Piraeus, it describes it as the dragon's head in its investments in Greece. This means that additional investments will come. And also the experience from the very first sale of the port of Piraeus, of Piers 2 and 3 since 2009, suggests that China can do more in Piraeus, and more Greek companies and other companies from all over the world can benefit by this deal. And what is highly important is not only that China will give some money to the Greek state, but it is prepared to make investment approximately worth of 1.5 billion euros. Of course, some problems are still here. It is the refugee crisis and the railway, which remains closed and was closed for a period of approximately 1 month. And obviously the Greek parliament has also to vote for the new agreement for the sale of the Piraeus Port Authority. But I believe that all this will overcome very soon, and that additional projects for China, like for example the construction of a high-speed railway which can connect Piraeus and then Central and Eastern Europe via the Balkans, can be soon constructed, and this will be very positive not only for the Greek economy but also for the European economy.
And Zhang Shishui, when we look at that railway connection link that George was just talking about, is that another key component of the One Belt, One Road initiative, the fact that there would be these rail links to the Balkans and to Central and Eastern Europe as well?
Yes, the so-called One Belt, One Road has this kind of a component, which means that China wants to have more roads, railroads, sea routes connecting China and other parts of the world. But for the railroad you mentioned, as far as I can read from the Chinese newspapers, I don't think China is going to make any bidding for this project because there's not enough time. But if there is a chance, I think China will be quite interested in this kind of railroad. And China wants to make contributions to this kind of facility, transportation, just between Greece and other parts of Europe.
Linda, when we look at the Port of Piraeus, it is, of course, at the center of what used to be the center of trade and commerce in the ancient world. And when you look at this kind of investment right now, can this region regain its place? Is there a huge growth opportunity here for the Mediterranean?
I think so. I know there's a lot of hand-wringing over growth in so-called peripheral Europe. So I'm talking about the rescued countries along the south, including Greece, but also obviously Portugal. But I think if you look at where the center of world economic gravity is, so the rise of China and the recovery of America, the center of world economic activity actually sits pretty squarely in the Mediterranean and that region. So if there could be much better trade links, much more open investment regimes, less regulation, all the things that companies need to reach different markets. I think there's a huge potential, but that's not to underemphasize the challenges that a country like Greece and some of its neighbors faces, because what we have seen during the European crisis, the Euro crisis, and specifically since Greece was first found some funny numbers back in 2010 and was rescued, the competitiveness and productivity challenge of the region is considerable, and for them to overcome that will require a lot of reforms to very strict labor market rules, things that are difficult to reform, but also being able to pick up more know-how and transfers of knowledge and technology from foreign investment. That's traditionally how countries recover on the back of being open and having exports and investment links. But all of that is a big ask, and I think it's more the domestic challenges, I would stress, for countries in Southern Europe than perhaps the external ones.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation right after that. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China's trade plans and growing investment in Greece. Let's get back to our panel. And George, I want to get back to Greek perceptions of how it sees its way out of the crisis that it faces. In a column you wrote last month, you wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Since the outbreak of the Greek crisis in October 2009, China has been perceived by some Greek politicians and a significant part of the public as a potential savior." Does Greece now see its future and a way out of its crisis more with countries like China rather than the rest of Europe, or perhaps with both blocs?
Well, the problem in the case of the Greek crisis is that people themselves do not believe that the current bailout might produce some positive results. The problem is that by the end of 2014, the Greek government, the then Greek government, had achieved some great progress in terms of reducing the budget deficit and the current account deficit. Then we had a period of reconsideration for 6 months with the leftist government in power. Now this leftist government landed into reality and attempts to apply some bailout terms. It is difficult. It's certainly difficult not only for the government itself, but also for citizens. But investments like the one which are made by China in the port of Piraeus are a step towards the right direction, because what Greece needs is investments, especially investments coming from other countries. And in that regard, I consider the recent deal in Piraeus as very, very significant. And obviously, as far as China is concerned, it's certainly a lesson to be learned by some of the politicians who had believed that China or could function as a savior in the course of the Greek economy. China is not a deus ex machina which can help Greece. China can contribute to Greek recovery via investments, but the country is not prepared to grant bilateral loans to Greece, and this is a lesson to be certainly learned.
Jiang Shuhui, this is also a region that faces enormous political and security challenges. We know that there is a refugee crisis going on right now, refugees traveling from the Middle East, from North Africa, from West Africa. There is the threat of terrorism as well. Is there a risk that China could become embroiled in these challenges, or can China just come along and say, look, all we're interested is in trade and an economic relationship, the political stuff, the security stuff, that's not our concern?
Well, you are right saying that this area is not so stable. There are some places which are hit by civil wars, terrorist attacks, all kinds of things. But on the whole, I would say that this area is safe. You know, so we cannot say that there is a Syrian war, so China will stop making investment in the area. Well, just look at Afghanistan. There are Chinese investments. Look at these terrible places in such countries as Iraq. There are Chinese investment. So we can see that so where there is sunshine, there is Chinese investment. So China wants to make investment, wants to help develop the local economy.
Linda, when we look at this investment, according to The Diplomat, an online newspaper, Chinese banks are also making pretty considerable loans to Greek ship owners who've agreed to build their ships in China. So that makes this very much a win-win situation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think anytime you see needed investment funds coming, you're always going to welcome that. And Greece, as well as the rest of Europe, is very much short of investment funds. The recent estimates by the IMF and others is that investment is something like 20% the pre-crisis trend. And so that is going to be something, I think, that's going to be welcome. I think probably the thing with Chinese investment is that Europe has a more relaxed attitude about whether it comes from a state-owned bank or a state financing of some sort. And that's also why it's a bit easier to do deals in Europe than, say, in the US, where the source of funds being coming from the state would raise some questions. But I think also if you think about building ships in China, that's also a way of transferring the know-how of very considerable experience from Greek ship owners into a higher-end manufacturing for China. And in that sense, that's a good use of outward investment funds. You always want investment to have what we economists call positive spillovers. A knowledge transfer tends to do that. But I suppose if you look at Greece and the high levels of unemployment and the real cuts in wages that people have suffered, I would imagine there's also a desire for more manufacturing to remain in Greece. And that's one of the sources of tension that I mentioned earlier.
And George, how important is the whole idea of privatization and the sale of national assets like the Port of Piraeus to Greece's economic recovery?
Well, let me start by the image of China, which is highly positive in Greece. So as opposed to the stance of the trade unions, which is not related to China, it's related to privatization in general, this investment is seen by the majority of Greek citizens in a positive way. And this is also the case with additional investments which have been made or which can be made in the future. So we should not confuse the stance of the trade unions, which had been very powerful in the past, with what the majority of Greek citizens believe. In that regard, I think that China can benefit a lot, not only in the Port of Piraeus, but generally in future investments it seeks to make in the case of Greece. So the majority of Greek citizens have started to realize that without investments coming from foreign countries, it's almost impossible for Greece to get out of the crisis. This needs time. At the beginning of the crisis, there was kind of a sentiment in Greece that privatization might lead Greece to lose national sovereignty, but at the same time we should also bear in mind that Greece is member of the Eurozone, member of the European Union, and the loss of national sovereignty is not a Greek phenomenon per se, but it's also a case for other Eurozone and European Union countries. So therefore the positive news for Greece is that the majority of citizens start to realize that without foreign investment it's impossible for Greece to go back to the previous decades of maladministration. And foreign investments are a key in order to contribute to recovery, how we call it.
Jiang Shuhui, what are some of the other projects that China is working on in countries in this region, in the Mediterranean region, as it seeks to try and expand the One Belt, One Road economic plan?
I would say Italy might be the place where China has made lots of investment. And because of time, I can tell you only one typical example. There's a big Italian company making tires called Filali. So China has purchased this company. So I think by the time China purchased the company early last year, it was China's biggest investment in the manufacturing sector all over the world. So that will also create jobs for Italy, and that will be also nice for China. So it's one more case of win-win for China and the foreign countries in Europe or in other parts of the world.
Linda, the Chinese investment in Europe hit $23 billion. That's a record, and that's despite the slowdown at home for China. And we all know that the One Belt, One Road initiative, as Shuhui has been telling us, is a hugely ambitious project to connect Asia to Europe. Is this the area where China sees the biggest potential for growth?
I think it's certainly one of the areas. Certainly the fact that outward investment has grown and really expanded is actually, I think, related to the domestic slowdown. So one of the big reasons why you have a burst of overseas investments is that Chinese domestic firms are going global. As domestic markets become saturated in some segments, they're seeking overseas opportunities. So as growth at home slows, they're looking for new global markets. And that's one of the reasons why if you take commercial outward investment by big companies, we know about Alibaba, we know about Huawei, if you take those companies on top of state-owned investments, predominantly in energy and resources and commodities and some real assets, that combination actually reflects a maturation of China's economy. When you become a middle-class, middle-income economy like China with a big middle class, you do begin to find net capital flows going outward, and your companies strive to be globally competitive. And if China can achieve that, I think that's going to be the biggest part of the growth engine in the future, because if China produced multinationals that could compete with the best in the world, that's a sign of productivity and technological progress. That kind of advance would be able to lift Chinese growth, not necessarily to make it grow faster, but to make it grow fast enough so that China could become prosperous and overcome the so-called middle income trap, where countries slow down so much when they become middle income, they don't grow any further. So I see China's outward investment in all of these guises as being absolutely critical to its future growth prospects if it wants to have a more balanced growth that's driven by productivity and technology and less by the old drivers, which we know can't be sustained once a country reaches this stage. And Europe is a key part, I think, of this because of its receptiveness to Chinese investment.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV_America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.